Since last November, the residents of the tiny upstate village of Hoosick Falls have been using bottled water for drinking and cooking after contamination was discovered in the local water supply. But it was a warning bell that was sounded by some residents more than a year earlier. Today, residents stock up on bottled water at the local supermarket, where it's provided at no cost to the roughly 3,500 residents. Hoosick Falls is located about 30 miles from the state capital and just 13 miles west of Bennington, Vermont, in rural Rensselaer County. Recent concerns about the water began with Michael Hickey, a lifelong resident. In February of 2013, Michael's father, John, died of liver cancer. Since a factory was built on McCaffrey Street here in Hoosick Falls nearly 50 years ago, there had been talk of elevated levels of cancer in the village. The rumor was that there was something in the water. Getting no cooperation initially from the Hoosick Falls mayor, Hickey decided to test the water himself, and in late summer 2014, he found something.
2 weeks later, the samples came back, and sure enough, we were positive.
There were positive readings for a hazardous chemical known as PFOA. The federal guideline for it in 2014 was less than 400 parts per trillion. One of Michael's samples was more than 150 parts above that. He began working with Albany attorney David Engel, whose firm practices environmental law.
PFOA is an extraordinarily persistent chemical. It does not break down in the environment, doesn't biodegrade. Once it's in the environment, it's going to stay there. It's going to move around because it's highly soluble.
According to the state, one of the sources of contamination is the Saint-Gobain plant located in Hoosick Falls. The plant manufactures plastics and uses chemicals including PFOA.
Austère, hautaine, derrière ces hautes murailles.
Saint-Gobain is a French company that traces its origins back to 1665 during the reign of King Louis XIV. It was originally a producer of glass, but later branched out to other materials. The company bought the Hoosick Falls facility in 1999. The main drinking water well for the village is located just 400 yards from the plant, and the company's own well tests in the summer of 2015 revealed heightened levels of PFOA, including one well that was dug adjacent to the plant, where the level of PFOA in the water was 18,000 parts per trillion, 45 times the recommended level.
The long-term exposure is probably what's been shown to be, the most toxic with this chemical. So even with low levels, if you have a long-term exposure to it, you're more likely to have the health effects with it.
Dr. Marcus Martinez, a cancer survivor himself, says PFOA has been shown to cause higher levels of testicular cancer, thyroid disease, and liver cancer, which is what claimed the life of John Hickey.
Certainly, if you just look at our area over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we certainly seem to have a high incidence of cancers in general, of all types, that seem to be higher than what you would expect.
Engel contacted Saint-Gobain in October of 2015, and after a meeting, the company agreed to begin paying for bottled water for all residents of Hoosick Falls. A month later, the EPA wrote a letter to Hoosick Falls Mayor David Borge recommending, quote, an alternate drinking water source for all residents. On November 29th, the bottled water program was put into place. But in December, the state health department issued a fact sheet telling residents that, quote, health effects are not expected to occur from normal use of the water. The state said this despite its own tests that showed PFOA levels for at least 4 wells in the 600 parts per trillion, well over the EPA guideline of 400 parts.
That was a conclusion that we thought was categorically incorrect and inappropriate. And that was in December. Since that time, thankfully, the Department of Health seems to have modified its view.
State officials maintain that long-term health studies haven't yet been completed. It was not until January 27th of this year that State Department of Environmental Protection and state health officials issued emergency regulations.
Today, Governor Cuomo directed the D.C. and DOH to come up with a series of actions to restore the public's confidence in Hoosick Falls.
It was at this same press conference last month that Health Commissioner Howard Zucker claimed the state was first alerted to the contamination problem only 6 months ago, even though records show his department was informed as early as November 2014 and multiple times since then.
6 months ago, we were approached by the community. We started to measure the levels.
Some local residents were not eager to go public with the water contamination story, worried that their property values could plunge and the factory could leave, costing them jobs.
And any concerns people might have had about the water story getting out have actually come to fruition. For example, banks have stopped lending so that people who want to buy in this town can no longer get a mortgage.
Responding to fears about the local economy and home values, the state has deployed representatives from the Department of Financial Services to the village this week to meet with residents. And last Friday, after students at the local high school held a forum and press conference to discuss the water contamination issue, they asked Governor Cuomo to make plans for a brand new water supply. 17-year-old Anna Wasaki was one of the leading student voices.
It's unsettling, to say the least. A lot of my friends and I do live in the village. Over half of kids in Hoosick Falls Central School live in the village. And it's definitely just like what? We've been drinking poisoned water all of our lives.
A few hours after the student press conference, the governor's office responded, saying it would install water filtration systems for roughly 1,500 homes in Hoosick Falls. This comes on top of the long-term carbon filtration system Saint-Gobain had already promised to provide. Cuomo also said the state would begin planning for an entirely new source of fresh drinking water. State officials were in Hoosick Falls this past weekend offering blood tests to concerned residents. The governor has been asked about the state response several times this month.
The environmental agencies, particularly on the federal side, are now reevaluating what are the acceptable levels and what chemicals should be tested for and what chemicals should be regulated.
But the governor has also shown signs of not being totally up to speed on the issue.
I just don't know the facts, Now, you get a lot of suggestions that there is something in the water. That complaint is a growing complaint.
I think these were tests by the DOH that confirmed that there was PFOA, the chemical in question was there.
The initial tests were 14 months ago, actually.
Yeah, and they showed, you're saying the tests showed an issue?
They showed PFOA, which is the chemical in question here, at a concentration, I think in some cases, above 400 parts per trillion, which is the EPA threshold.
Well, those would be, we need to know the facts, and I don't know those as the facts.
For Michael Hickey and those who've lost loved ones, the response from the state is welcome, even if their initial request to local officials went unanswered.
We're seeing a response now, but we're also a year and a half later from the confirmation of what we actually had here. So that was a little bit of a discouraging part with it.